So in biblical times, marriage between the groom and a bride is very heavily belief based. It's just as much with Jesus as it is with the bride or groom. In 2 Corinthians 11:2, Apostle Paul says, "For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to the Messiah." To be betrothed is to be engaged, and in biblical times, they believed that both the male and female were spiritually engaged to the bridegroom. The bridegroom is Jesus or Yeshua, and marriage is the most intimate human relationship according to Jewish biblical times. And it also represents the most intimate relationship with God. So in biblical times, the brides were usually chosen by the father of the bridegroom. They would have their servant search for the best bride for their son. And most of these marriages happen between two very young people, but if the bridegroom is old enough, they would have a say in the matter and confer with the father to pick the best bride. Um, so, yeah. Biblical times, the women were seen more of a commodity. They were oftentimes purchased. Marriage was oftentimes a transaction. The father of the bridegroom would pay a price, or mohar in Hebrew, in exchange for the marriage. Two reasons for this payment. Firstly, it was made to compensate the loss of a household worker, the bride. And secondly, it was a token of appreciation. It was used to show the bride how much the bridegroom loved and cared for her. And the act of being purchased can be seen on a spiritual level, because the Messiah, Jesus, he paid a very high price for the lives of all of Jewish people, and it was his blood he paid in order for them to have life. So the betrothal, or the ketubah, is the first of two main parts of the marriage, and this is the engagement. Usually it could happen up to a year before the actual wedding, and this is the part of the process where God becomes one with the relationship. Holy matrimony is introduced here, and the engagement in biblical times is like a covenant. It was serious, blood binding, and it could not be broken easily. At the betrothal ceremony, a contract was given to the father of the bride. This would include the price, or the mohar, for the bride, and the promises that the bridegroom would make. The bride the bride did have a say in whether or not the proposed marriage contract would be signed. Mutual consent was always needed in Jewish weddings, and this is kind of similar to saying "I do" in nowadays. And it's also consent for God to become one with the relationship. Once that agreement was made, the bridegroom and bride would share a cup of wine together, making the covenant official. The bride and groom would share the same cup, and this was done to show their newly shared life. And they would drink wine because in Jewish culture, wine is a symbol of great joy, and marriage in Judaism is one of the highest joys that you can achieve. At this point, many gifts were given to the bride from the bridegroom. They can be anything from money, items, animals, or services, and they're meant for the bride to be thinking about the bridegroom and to remind her of him. The mikveh, in ancient times, it was a pool of water that was used for ritual purification. The brides would immerse themselves in the water as spiritual preparation for their marriage, and this act would symbolize the change of one life to another. A life of singularity, being alone, not in a relationship in a marriage, to one of companionship. So the huppah is the second part of the wedding marriage ceremony, and this refers to the ceremony as well as the bridal canopy used that you can see in the picture. In ancient times, this would be usually taking place in the bridegroom's father's home. And this represented a new home that the bride would be taken to by the bridegroom, and represents a Jewish house filled with love. And in biblical times, the huppah was made with trees planted at the birth of the bridegroom and bride. And after this, the 7 blessings are chanted by those attending, and they have religious significance and signify the beginning of a married life. I'll just say the first 3 because it's quite long, but the first one goes, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine." Second is, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has created all things to thy glory." Third is, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of man. And it goes on, similar to that. Once this is done, the bride and bridegroom will break the glass. This is really well-known tradition in Jewish weddings. And they would usually break a small glass under a napkin. And this signified the reality that their two lives would not be the same. They've been altered now because they're married. And then that two lives have become one. There are religious parallels to the Huppah. And in Jewish religion, when one is lifted into heaven, they spend 7 years with the Messiah to become one with him, with Jesus. And in marriage, in ancient times, the bride and groom would spend 7 days in the wedding chamber. Once they spent that week in the wedding chamber, the bride and bridegroom, along with their guests, would share a festive feast. They would play music, and traditional dances were done, as this was a religious duty back in biblical times. And the feast was meant to instill bliss onto the bride and groom. So we can compare how marriages were in biblical times to today. Many of these traditions stayed the same throughout history, but a lot have been altered. It depends on how connected the bride and groom are with their religious roots. So a traditional Jewish wedding in modern day will most likely include many of these things. Modern day, there's obviously no selection of the bride. It just, they don't, the bridegroom's father isn't out, making arranged marriages. But over the last 40 years, there's been an increase for the fight of women's rights in Judaism, and they've increased immensely. A lot of Jewish feminists began demanding women's roles increased in marriage and leadership. And they became equal to men in this situation. And the marriage became less of a transaction, a purchase of the bride, and more of a beautiful spiritual moment between two equal people. This change has been seen throughout all dominations, or excuse me, not all, but most denominations in Judaism, except for Orthodox, which makes up about 15% of Jewish people. There's no, official price for the bride, but now there will be an exchange of rings, and that's pretty common among most marriages. Usually just a plain wedding band. The betrothal still takes place in weddings today, and is usually done in a synagogue. A rabbi would recite the covenant for the bride and bridegroom, and once they both say "I do," they drink wine from the cup of covenant, and then produce those rings to each other. This covenant obviously is not as serious, not serious, but not as final as it was back in biblical times, because the acceptance of divorce has increased in Judaism over time. As for the mikvah, it's not common for the bride to be immersed in water, but there are variations to this in more modern marriages. And the huppah, bridal canopy, is still used widely in many Jewish weddings. They use velvet cloth, silk to make the bridal canopy, and the 7 blessings are still sung by the rabbi or the male guests of the wedding. And then after this comes the breaking of the glass. Like I said, it's very well known, and it signifies the end of the wedding. And then after that, there's usually a reception with a large feast, traditional Jewish dancing and music. So next I'll talk about birth in biblical times. So in Judaism, there are several stages of life. First stage is ages 0 to 15, and it represents the learning period of the Torah. Ages 15 to 50 represent raising a family and having social responsibilities. Ages 50 to 80 represent time of wisdom and counsel, and after 80, it's the preparation for the end of their life. And so birth of a child is the fulfillment of the first mitzvah in the Torah. So it's a religious fulfillment that Jewish people will do. In Genesis 1, it says to be fruitful and multiply. It's one of the fulfillments. So for the male, there are 2 ceremonies with birth, the circumcision and the redemption of the firstborn. And the circumcision will occur on the 8th day of life. According to the Talmud, if there is a death during the childbirth, it would be caused by the woman not fulfilling her classic roles. And in biblical times, these classic roles were observance of family purity, separating of the challah, which is a bread offering, and kindling of Shabbat lights. So back in biblical times, there's many dangers of childbirth just because of the lack of technology, lack of science, lack of understanding of the human body. And so during this time, there are a lot of traditions that the Jewish religion adopted to try to protect the mother from evil spirits. Many things were done, such as leaving open doors, open cupboards, untying knots, unbuttoning any buttons so the mother's womb would stay open. The mother would wear a sacred belt of holy sage. She would hold a key to the synagogue in her hand during birth. People would recite passages from Psalms while the mother was in labor, and even swinging a hen in circles around the mother's head to atone for her sins. And so many of these traditions did not start in Judaism, but were adopted by Jewish people because they didn't have their own traditions. For example, the swinging of the hen around the mother's head is a Kurdistani tradition adopted by them. And on top of these traditions, people would place charms and amulets around the bed of the mother to ward off the evil spirit Lilith, who in biblical times was Adam's first wife and a female evil spirit, an enemy of newborns. And after the birth of the child, they made the mother stay up for 3 days after birth to make sure that this spirit Lilith would not harm her. So for the sons, on the Friday evening after the birth of a boy, Shalom Zahar would take place. This literally means peace to the male child. Friends and family would come, pray, read, recite from the Torah, and eat a festive meal. Another special night is the night before circumcision. It's a home ceremony that takes place, Lil Shimmerin, and it means the night of watching. So friends and family would come to make sure the baby was healthy and safe. They ate beans and peas to ward off evil spirits, and they would hold a vigil around the crib of the baby and recite the Torah. Circumcision is the act of removal of the foreskin of the penis, and this happens on the 8th day of life. It's in itself is a covenant with God. In Genesis, Abraham circumcised himself and all members of the house per request of God. This tradition maintained, and it's considered the main symbol of membership within Jewish tradition for men. It's done to show just sanctification to the divine service, and it was also done as a wish for fertility. And like I said, it's the Jewish goal to have as many children as possible. So the mother would hand the baby to the godmother, who would hand it to the godfather, who would hand it to the father. The reason this is done is because the mother was ritually impure from childbirth, so she was not able to hand it directly to the father. The father would say words saying he's ready to fulfill the mitzvah and circumcise his son. He would hand the son to his father, the son's grandfather, who would hold the baby on a pillow, and a mohel, who is a person practiced in circumcisions, would perform it. And then after, the parents of the children would bless the child and drink wine. It was done for many reasons, mainly as an everlasting covenant between the Son and God. It was also done to weaken male sex drive, to promote health and hygiene, and make a sacrifice to God. This was their reasoning in biblical times. Like I said, there was a lot of Jewish feminists in the early 1970s that were pushing for equality between sexes in the religion. And so it's more popular that there is a 8th day celebration for girls as well when they're born. The parents would have the liberty to make the celebration special to them. This always includes friends, family, food, festivities, and reading from the Torah and wine. Naming the child. In Jewish culture, it is seen that the name of the child will control the soul and destiny of the child. So it's a large importance that the name is right for the child. During biblical times, the name of a child had a large connection to the child's good fortune or an event that took place in the past. There's many names associated with the Bible that contain God in them, and parents would use these names to praise God or guarantee divine protection. So modern day birth, many of the traditions are not used anymore simply because births are taking place in hospitals rather than in the homes where death and childbirth is much more likely. So there's no need for any of those traditions that they adopted. But as for circumcisions, they're still done widely. Many are still done in the hospital, but also Jewish families will have a mohel that will do it on the 8th day. So yeah, some of those traditions are still intact. So recap, I focused on Jewish weddings in biblical times, the traditions that took place and how they compared to modern day weddings, and also looked at birth traditions in biblical times and how they compare to the traditions of today. Thank you.